Hello, everybody. So today I decided to get out of my closet and get into a sunnier spot as we talk about abnormal psychology. Just so you know, so you are able to kind of track with us in the book, we are actually looking at chapter 14, which is it's labeled psychological disorders. So what are psychological disorders? By the way, I'm pretty sure that this is why a lot of you took this class, because you wanted to know what in the heck is wrong with my family and friends. And so you will not be qualified at the end of this chapter to diagnose your friends and family, but we might give you some things to think about through this. So let's get started. So basically, abnormal psychology or psychological disorders are defined as a harmful dysfunction in which the behavior is judged to be atypical, disturbing, maladaptive, or unjustifiable. Again, there are things that we do all the time in life that it seems like if you just looked at the action itself, it would seem maybe that it was disturbing. But when you put it into context of a situation, it might have a very good explanation as to why you behaved in such a way. And so this is when it is considered unjustifiable or maladaptive. So you guys get to sit in the therapist chair for just a few minutes, and you get to kind of decide what do you consider to be abnormal behavior and what do you consider to be normal. Okay, and you're going to rate them from 1 to 4. So let's get started. Bob is a very intelligent 25-year-old member of a religious organization that is based on Buddhism. Bob's working for this organization caused considerable conflict between him and his parents, who are devout Catholics. Recently, Bob experiences acute spells of nausea and fatigue that prevent him from working and which have forced him to return home to live with his parents. Various medical tests are being conducted, but as of yet, no physical causes of this problem have been found. Okay. So, you get to tell me, do you think that, well, Bob is basically okay, psychotherapy is not necessary? Or do you think, Bob is having a mild disturbance, maybe he should go to some counseling? Or are you thinking, nope, I think number 3, there is a significant disturbance and psychotherapy is definitely required? Or number 4, is there a severe disturbance and Bob needs to be hospitalized right away? Well, I will tell you, if you think he needs to be hospitalized, that's probably, at this point, he's not at risk of hurting himself or hurting somebody else. That's usually kind of the measuring stick that we use for hospitalization. Is he okay? Number 1, well, he can't work anymore. And he had to go live at home again with his parents. So I'm thinking that it is getting in the way, that his behavior and his issues are getting in the way of his everyday functioning. So I'm guessing it's not number 1. So it's not number 1, it's not number 4. If you guess number 2 or 3, you are probably on track. Is there a disturbance? Yes. And actually, I would, as a therapist, say probably it's a significant disturbance to keep him from working and to make him move back home. And he's going through all these medical tests. So again, it's getting in the way enough of his everyday functioning that he probably does definitely need to get some counseling to figure things out. Okay? Did you like being the therapist? Let's try another one. Okay, so Jim was vice president of the freshman class at a local college and played on the school's football team. Later that year, he dropped out of these activities and gradually became more and more withdrawn. I lost my place. He became more and more withdrawn from friends and family. Neglecting to shave and shower, he began to look dirty and unhealthy. He spent most of his time alone in his room and sometimes complained to his parents that he heard voices in the curtains and in the closet. In his sophomore year, he dropped out of school entirely with increased anxiety and agitation. He began to worry that the Nazis were plotting to kill his family and to kidnap him. Okay, so it sounds like Jim is definitely having some issues. So if you think he's okay and psychotherapy is not necessary, probably not. How about mild disturbance? Well, I'm thinking it's more than a mild disturbance. So really, we are looking at between 3 and 4. Significant disturbance and severe disturbance. You know what? He definitely needs some kind of counseling. Does he need hospitalized? I think that's the bigger question. Here is my concern. So you remember that measuring stick I told you? When it comes to hospitalizations, we ask that question. Are they at risk of hurting themselves or hurting somebody else? He isn't threatening to do that at this point, but I will tell you, it makes me nervous that he is believing that the Nazis are plotting to kill his family and to kidnap him. That tells me that what happens if his parents walk around the corner in the middle of the night, like they just go to get a midnight snack or something? Is Jim going to think that they're the Nazis and he's going to attack them or do something? And so part of me thinks that he probably does need hospitalization, just temporarily. Really what they would do in a hospital in this case is they would get him stabilized on some kind of medication. I will tell you, we're going to talk later in this chapter about schizophrenia, but one of the tells of schizophrenia, one of the symptoms, is hearing voices that aren't really there. And so to get medicated would help take away those voices and hopefully take away some of the paranoia. So, are you guys on track with me yet? Are you guys being good therapists right now? So let's try the next one. Okay, so Mary is a 30-year-old musician who is very dedicated and successful in her work as a teacher in a local high school and is a part-time member of a local musical group. Since her marriage 5 years ago, which ended in divorce after 6 months, ooh, that's rough, she has dated very few men. She often worries that her time is running out for establishing a good relationship with a man, getting married, and raising a family. Her friends tell her that she gets way too anxious around men and that she needs to relax a little in general. Okay, so there's our scenario with Mary. How many of you are thinking, oh, she needs hospitalized right away? Okay, yeah, she probably doesn't. She's doing good. Is this getting in the way of her everyday functioning? The answer is no. Now, I'm a therapist, so I kind of believe that everybody could use some help sometimes to just talk things out with somebody who's not related to them. It's just kind of helpful to get that party that's outside of your usual little bubble to throw the ideas off of. So I think it's a tie between 1 and 2. She's basically okay. She doesn't need counseling. Could she maybe use it? Absolutely, because it sounds like maybe she has some baggage from that marriage, that there's some things that have bothered her. And so it might be helpful for her just to talk about that with somebody. Okay, so the term, this is college word that if you use it, you'll sound really smart. Psychopathology, which is basically the study of abnormal behavior, and that is what you're going to do during this chapter. How do you use that in a sentence to sound smart? How about, well, the psychopathology of that character in the movie? People will be like, what are they talking? Wow, they're smart. But yeah, psychopathology, that's the term that we use for this, okay? Okay, so let's dive really fast, just a brief history of this that tells us back many years ago, we're talking hundreds of years, really people thought when people behaved differently, or what we would now consider a little bit on maybe the crazy side, things like depression and anxiety were not necessarily perceived as a problem back then. We're talking people who really had some very abnormal behaviors, like talking to themselves, but not in a healthy way, like reminding yourself of your shopping list kind of way. It was more of people who were talking to people who weren't there, psychotic individuals. This is what was considered abnormal, of course. You would consider it abnormal today, but it's a pretty extreme version of abnormal, right? The perceived cause at the time was basically thinking that it had something to do with movements of the sun or the moon. You've heard the term lunatic? Well, lunacy was a full moon. You've heard that, when people might go, man, it must be a full moon out today because people are driving crazy. Or if you work in a hospital, I know some of you are going to end up being nurses. You might have that thought sometimes, wow, it must be a full moon. We've just seen it all tonight. Guess what? That goes back to years and years ago of believing that was the cause of some craziness in the world. Another thought was that people might have evil spirits that are like they are basically possessed. And so, of course, they used a lot of very unhealthy things in order to relieve a person of evil spirits. Hippocrates, though, he was a Greek physician, and he believed that illness of the body and mind were results of imbalances in the body's vital fluids, or what he called humors. These humors were like phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. He was really the first to believe that, and I know that let me see if I can, oops. There we go. He was the first to believe that that abnormal behavior was due to some kind of biological process. Okay, and so he was the first one to say maybe it's not the moon, maybe it's not evil spirits, but maybe something that's going on inside of the body. Okay. Early mental hospitals, basically, they were nothing more than barbaric prisons. The patients were chained, they were locked away. In some hospitals, even charged admission for the public to see crazies, just like at a zoo. It was not a good thing. And mental hospitals really had a bad rap for many, many years. They're still not a place that you probably want to go if you have a choice. Usually people need to go there now. If they're there because they need to be there to get at least stabilized. But back in history, they were definitely barbaric. Okay, so let's talk about what is abnormal. I'm going to get out of the screen here. Okay, so what is abnormal? Well, abnormal is basically all a matter of degree. We're going to look at a bunch of things that make behaviors considered abnormal, because here's the deal. If you are in a scary situation, let's say you're walking let's say you're hiking out in the forest and a bear comes out of nowhere. Would it be normal that you're scared? Absolutely. Would we consider that an anxiety disorder? No, not at all. And so we have to look at the difference between normal and abnormal. Well, the first difference is statistically speaking. Frequently occurring behaviors are considered normal, and behavior that is rare would be abnormal. So when you see a person, if you see a person walking around naked in the grocery store, is that considered normal or abnormal? I'm hoping you would consider that abnormal. How about if you saw a person at an amusement park, I don't know, dancing with a character? Well, it's an amusement park, so that would be considered normal in the context of where they are. If you saw a person dancing out in the middle of the street, though, you might go, that's a little abnormal. unless they have a sign in their hand and they are a sign spinner. Then you might go, okay, that makes sense. Something else we look at are social norms. What is the situational context? Something that goes against the norms or standards of society, well, that is considered abnormal. So I love this picture. It's kind of fun. In the Wadabi tribe, men wear costumes to attract women. But would you guys do this in Modesto, California? No. In Western society, this would be considered highly abnormal. We also take into consideration the discomfort of the subject, of whoever is experiencing it. If a person is experiencing emotional distress while engaging in a particular behavior, we definitely want to take that into consideration. So the example I have here is the person who's paralyzed by fear. Let's say there's a woman who suffers from fear of going outside of her house. They would be experiencing a great deal of anxiety when trying to leave their home. But that might not be something that subjectively that you experience, but we need to take into account it is real for them. And so if it is real for them, then we do consider it abnormal and we want to help them get through that. We also look at, is a behavior considered maladaptive? Basically, this person can't adapt to day-to-day demands. So it might be behavior that initially may help a person cope, but ends up having a harmful or damaging effect. Unfortunately, our world is full of this. We call them addictions a lot of times. Of course, you might drink alcohol, partly to have fun, partly to relax, part of your dinner maybe. However, when does it become a maladaptive behavior? If it's what you need to do to cope, is it becoming an addictive behavior? Eating, I know that's what this person's doing. How many of us stress eat? I know I've asked that question before and almost everybody always raises their hands. We do a lot of emotional eating. Is it actually, it's not solving an issue, it's helping us cope, but in the end, is it a maladaptive habit that we're forming? Another one that your book mentions is cutting. I'm not going to ever ask you guys who is cutting or not cutting, but I cannot tell you how many, especially junior high age, try cutting or self-harm in order to cope with their negative emotions or the feeling of numbness that's what a lot of times they'll explain that to me. However, is that maladaptive? Absolutely. Okay, let's look at the word insanity. In a person, this is not a diagnosis. I want to make that very clear. Insanity is really, it is a legal term that is used to argue that a defendant is mentally ill and should not be held responsible for his or her action or crime. Really fast, kind of, if you remember, several years ago, we had Officer Wallace who was killed in the line of duty. I had followed this case a little bit, and it has still, I don't believe it has gone to trial yet, but last year, they basically had, his lawyers had said, they were wanting him to be found insane and that he was unable to stand trial. What happened though, like a year went by and his attorneys came back to court and said, you know what, well, we want to take insanity off the table and go ahead and proceed like a normal trial. Interestingly, the prosecution said, no. We want to make sure that he's not insane. We want to go ahead and have a mental health evaluation done so that he can't come back and try to have the ruling overturned if he's found guilty in order to, and that he was actually insane. And so they put the trial on hold to wait for this evaluation. And so from there, I'm not sure exactly where it's gone yet, but just kind of an interesting Like this was definitely a legal move on both parts. So when we start to study psychological disorders, one thing that I think is really important to realize is, do you remember when we talked about the hand? Remember that? What was the thumb? Psychodynamic. Remember looking at the past? Our pointer finger. Cognitive. How we think and process about things. It's all coming full circle, right? We've been learning about all of this throughout our semester. Our middle finger, behavioral, learned. Ring finger, I'm missing my ring today. Ring finger is humanistic. We're going to talk more about that actually next week when we talk about treatment, because it really has a lot more to do with treatment. And then pinky was biological. Remember, we still have so much to learn about biological and how our brain works and our neurology. Our palms, sociocultural, and our wrists, I look weird, that was evolutionary. If you remember correctly, those were the different perspectives that we view psychology through, and different explanations. And the same thing works when it comes to studying psychological disorders. We look at the 7 different perspectives to try to understand why these behaviors occur. Like I said, sociocultural. They might believe that the problem reflects cultural or values and beliefs. Behavioral might believe that there's inappropriate conditioning or modeling. Evolutionary, they would believe that this behavior is an exaggerated form of or of adaptive reaction. Humanistic might believe that, well, the person is blocked in their personal growth. Psychoanalytic would believe that there's an unconscious, unresolved conflict. Cognitive believes faulty thinking. And biological would believe that, well, there must be a problem with the brain functioning, or maybe they're genetically predisposed, or maybe there's something going on with their biochemistry. What we have done is we have developed what's called now, we are in the fifth book of this, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Basically, this is the big book of disorders. This DSM is what we usually call it. It classifies disorders and describes the symptoms. There's over 400 disorders that are put in there. The DSM does not explain any causes or any possible cures. It is literally just for the use of diagnosing. So why do we do this? When we label psychological disorders, I will tell you, it has some pros and it has some cons. The pros are definitely, it gives all the professionals out there a common language to use. If we're all working out of the same book, then we all know that if somebody comes into my office and says, well, my doctor diagnosed me with anxiety, well, I know what that means based on the DSM. And it helps us have common treatment plans because of that. We are speaking the same language. The cons, well, the cons could be sometimes labeling has a long-lasting effect on a person. It can affect relationships with others, and it actually can have some legal ramifications. I really don't like labeling. I think it can be really difficult. It's difficult for a client if they know what their label is, if they're not feeling comfortable with that label. Unfortunately, in legally and ethically, I'm supposed to diagnose each of my clients, even if they're just coming in because they're just wanting to talk out an issue. And so I give them a kind of what I would consider a mild diagnosis. There's some ones that are definitely bigger and some that are lesser. And so if a person is in that situation where they're just wanting to chat, I will give them a lesser of the diagnoses. There was a guy by the name of David Rosenhan, though, that he really struggled with the whole idea of labeling. And so he convinced 7 others to participate in this with him, in this study. And they basically went to 12 mental hospitals within different states. When they got there, they complained of hearing voices, and these voices said three different things: empty, hollow, and thud, which, just so you know, this symptom does not necessarily represent any kind of unique disorder. Apart from this complaint and giving false names and occupations, they answered all the other questions truthfully. All 8 were diagnosed as mentally ill, and they were all hospitalized.
Nobody knew I'd be there for 2 months.
Wow, he was there for 2 months. That is crazy. So, as you saw in the video, staff all treated patients as if they were really ill, even though they were only saying they saw those 3 symptoms. Staff noted abnormal symptoms, even if there were not any, and they kept patients for an average of 19 days. So, again, I think this brings out, though, the importance of kind of not the importance, the beware of being labeled or labeling others. So as we do talk about the different diagnoses, just keep that in mind. Here is something that we definitely are aware of: the prevalence of mental health disorders. Basically, 48% of adults will experience symptoms at least one time in their lives. So that means that out of all of your classes, almost half of everybody in there will experience something. Maybe it's going to be you. And that could be anything from a mild depression to a severe depression, to anxiety, to something much more extreme. Approximately 80% of those who experience symptoms did not seek treatment last year. They basically were able to deal with their symptoms without complete debilitation. We also know that women do have a higher prevalence of depression and anxiety, while men have a higher prevalence of substance abuse and antisocial personality disorder. We're going to stop here and then continue on with anxiety disorder in the next slide.